All right, we're live. I'm here with Marc Blainey, an anthropologist who's written a book titled Christ Returns from the Jungle. It's based on a doctoral dissertation, in fact. And Marc and I have known each other for quite some time, I think, for well before the before times, well before the pre-COVID times. I actually met Marc when I was still finishing my master's degree at the University of Toronto, and I was just about to start my doctoral degree at the Free University of Brussels. And I had started to explore psychedelics in an intellectual level. My mind had been open to psychedelics, I think, from like a TED talk or Googling something, and then I just stumbled down the rabbit hole and just started to research as much as I could about psychedelics. And I forget who put me in contact with you, but I reached out. We had a coffee and talked about, I think we were talking about, the effects of psychedelics on a scientific materialist worldview and, these types of philosophical topics, the way they impact scientism or philosophy. In the years following our meeting, psychedelics actually played a big role in my personal spiritual development, and I actually ended up practicing with a group that Marc spent over a year doing an ethnographic research on for his doctoral program. And I actually quite not only enjoyed my time practicing with the Santo Daime, the group you've done your ethnographic research on, but the effect that the practices that I engaged in with the Santo Daime had a long-standing impact on my personal development, my intellectual development, my professional development. I think I often say when I talk about my psychedelic experiences that my entire concept of time as it related to my professional development was totally broken open. So like, for example, I would have in my head this goal towards becoming a professor or someone successful in the working world, and any deviation from that goal would provoke extreme emotional disturbances in my mind. And after my psychedelic experiences, that structure got blown apart, I think, and I always say I was much more just appreciative, more gratitude for what is going on in the now and where I am in the present moment. So it blew apart my temporal notion of self, I think, a little bit, and probably opened the door to even me being interested in exploring philosophy as like a deep, lifelong practice and stuff like that. So great here to connect with you, Marc. Why don't you introduce yourself and maybe a little bit about your book and the motivations behind writing Christ Returns from the Jungle?
Thank you very much, Cadell. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with you and your audience today. My name is Marc Blainey. I am a cultural anthropologist, but also a psychotherapist and a multi-faith chaplain. I work currently at a mental health or psychiatric hospital in Ontario, Canada. And I also am currently helping a team of interdisciplinary scholars and scientists run a clinical trial studying psilocybin, which comes from like magic mushrooms, for people that are struggling with major depressive disorder that's treatment resistant. So at this point, I have these. It's been a long sort of journey to get to the point of bringing these different aspects of my career together, and it all kind of really comes together in the book that we're going to discuss today, that was published late last year, Christ Returns from the Jungle, Ayahuasca Religion as Mystical Healing. And so it's kind of, why did I write this? Well, it goes back to when I wanted to become an anthropologist in the first place. When I was a little kid, I would have been about 8 years old. I was watching National Geographic documentaries, and they'd show these different cultures around the world that were so different than the suburban Toronto culture I grew up in, with these cookie cutter houses and sort of almost a sterile, cultureless wasteland, it felt to me, kind of growing up. And then I'd see these really interesting and enriching, dynamic cultures one of which was the ancient Maya, or the ancient Mesoamericans. And I remember being a little kid being really struck by some of these images of their art, the ancient Maya art, that would show some of their kings, queens, their priests, or their shamans, shamanesses, doing rituals in such a way as to try to open up a portal or a doorway to a spiritual otherworld. You can go up, in particular, there's an image called Lintel 24, which shows a woman pulling a rope laced with thorns through a hole in her tongue, and it's dropping blood onto a piece of bark that will then be burned, and out of that smoke comes a vision serpent, and out of the vision serpent's mouth comes one of her ancestors. And I just remember being struck as a kid, like, wow, that is so different and interesting compared to what I know. And so it just drew me into wanting to know more about why would these other cultures be trying to contact another world of spirits and ancestors. And the more I ended up doing a master's in archaeology, studying the ancient Maya, ended up co-editing a book that has a chapter on the ancient Maya use of entheogens. And something interesting I don't think we've studied enough yet is the ancient Maya used to also use iron ore polished stone mirrors, and they would do mirror gazing under the influence of these sacramental substances. These entheogens is another word when psychedelics are used in a ritual environment or ritual religious intention. Entheogen comes from the Greek for revealing the divine within. And so they would do these, whereas from a Western perspective, we might call it a hallucination. From the ancient Maya's perspective, when they saw the face change in the mirror, they believed it was actually contacting the spirit world and beings in the spirit world. So interesting things to study with mirror gazing going forward. My frustration after finishing that master's was that I couldn't talk to people and ask them questions. We could dig up bones and old artifacts, but the modern Maya people, the contemporary Maya people who have been subject to a lot of colonialism over hundreds of years, either they've gone into hiding with these old practices, or it's been lost. And so there aren't people I can really talk to about that. It was when I read a book by an Israeli cognitive psychologist. His name is Benny Shannon. He wrote what I consider the Bible of ayahuasca phenomenology, called Antipodes of the Mind. And I read that book, and it said, oh, people are modern people in the Amazon and across the world are engaging in similar intentions of contacting a spiritual otherworld through an entheogenic sacrament, and this was ayahuasca. And so that's when I shifted into cultural anthropology, went and did a PhD at Tulane, and yes, ended up spending a year going to the Santo Daime is this syncretic religion from the Amazon. It's a mixture of Afro-Brazilian spiritualism, indigenous shamanism, and Christianity, founded by a Afro-Brazilian rubber tapper named named Raimundo Irineu Serra. And the members of this Santo Daime religion call him Mestre Irineu, or Master Irineu. It is expanded all over the world. It's on every inhabited continent, just not Antarctica yet. And I wanted to spend a year doing field work with the Daimistas, or the members of the Santo Daime, in Europe. It's in 15 different countries there, and resulted in this book, which is sort of like a combination. It's actually meant to be written kind of like the ayahuasca vine, that is a double helix of two strands. One strand being sort of an adventure story of a young anthropologist going to the Amazon and then going to dozens and dozens of these Santo Daime rituals, which they call works, or in Portuguese, trabalhos, and an adventure story explaining what that was like and kind of taking the reader along on that adventure. And the other side is more of a classic scholarly, social scientific, analytical approach to trying to understand the main question, which is why are modern Europeans attracted to and then dedicating their lives to this contemplative practice.
That's great. I'll say quickly that actually I remember you recommending me what you call the Bible of Ayahuasca Phenomenology by Benny Shannon, and I I took you up on that suggestion and spent some good time with it in my doctoral research, and it's really a fantastic book. So for whoever's out there who wants to read another book, other than, of course, go pick up Christ Returns from the Jungle, but also check out the Antipodes of Mind by Benny Shannon. So, here your back. Let's start maybe with your background in suburban Toronto in a cookie cutter sort of landscape, and you can't think of anything quite as different from that than the culture of let's say a shamanic indigenous culture from South America, exploring psychedelic or entheogens, and experiencing certain psychological and perhaps beyond phenomena that challenge our conception of reality. So I think when you start your book, you're sort of wrestling, at least it seems to me, you're wrestling between these two crazy opposites, that the opposites of the irreligious, I think what you call the irreligious ideals of secular materialism on the one side, and the religious dogmas on the other side, where there's an afterlife, where there's an other side to this world, and these two seem to be irreconcilable in the Western context. And what it seems to me you're pointing towards is this third way, where there's this direct contact, and that there's this mystery of why people are now upset with these two polar opposites and striving for this third way. What have you found in your search between maybe these two dialectical opposites, and how they're being reconciled by the Santo Daime in your ethnographic research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yeah, I mean, I think that feeling, that unease or that disenchantment I was feeling at such a young age, I think I wasn't alone. I think there's a lot of people across the West who are feeling dissatisfied with the options that are available. I would point out, like, I don't want to take credit for the idea of highlighting that stuff. I give a lot of, I'm very grateful that actually one of perhaps the greatest living philosopher in Canada is Charles Taylor at McGill. He wrote a great book on trying to summarize the history of why we ended up here, called A Secular Age. And he talks about cross pressures, that discomfort, feeling like we all feel stuck between the polar opposites of like fundamentalist hardcore religion and fundamentalist hardcore secularism, scientism, materialism. And that it's sort of like we're forced into this false binary of having to choose one. And so another way I like a lot of the book, I rely on the theory of Soren Kierkegaard, who wrote a lot of books in the 19th century trying to understand the human condition. And he would often come to some of these same insights. There's a quote in my book from Kierkegaard where he says, "The secular mentality considers Christianity to be drunkenness, and Christianity considers the secular mentality to be drunkenness. The secular world, as is natural, speaks simply and solely about this world, does not know and does not wish to know that there is another world. Another world would indeed be a perilous discovery for this world." And so, yeah, I sometimes feel like we're trying to force ourselves into one of these boxes, either being a believer or a non-believer. There's all really, it goes back to that Cartesian cut of Descartes, right? That we have to split the world up. And so that caused, I think that was what was driving a lot of my search, was that discomfort, that not feeling right, that I actually liked having a foot in both worlds personally. And it felt like that was unwelcome or not allowed or somehow invalidated by the culture I was in. And that's what I found so refreshing about spending time with Daimistas is they turn to the ayahuasca experience. And it's not just the ayahuasca itself. A lot of the book spends a lot of time emphasizing that it's set and setting, right? That actually sometimes more important than the sacrament itself is the intention, the mindset that people have when they go into it and while they're under the influence. And then the overall sort of ritual structure, how the environment, the social and physical environment is set up, can make a big is it really determinative about how the experience can go and what we can get out of it. In this context, this special ritual structure of the Santo Daime works, my informants repeatedly, consistently would argue that they find solutions to that tension of cross pressures. And so I try to blow that. They would often use the word solutions in a multivalent sense of, not only do they get sort of practical solutions in their life, but they would say the practical solutions, whether it's interpersonal conflicts in their life or existential dilemmas or even psychological, physical illness, they find solutions to these multiple problems of their human life, because in taking the leap of faith into entering and engaging in these rituals, the ritual will cause ego death. So the ego itself is this sort of sense of separateness, the sense that I am an isolated individual, distinct and separate from what is not me. And that sort of dissolves and leaves one in a state where the ego's gone. The ego is what a lot of us in the West are taught to identify our selfhood with. When that ego, when the default mode network, the neurological correlates of the ego sort of are put on pause or they dissolve temporarily, the person gets a taste of being without the ego, that there's a part of oneself that exists below the ego more fundamentally. And they'll often say it's not in the head. They'll often say we're too heady, we're too mental. That's our problem in the West. That it's not forgetting. We need the mind as a tool, but in reconnecting with our heart, with our deeper fundamental self, with that part of ourselves that is connected to all life, to all beings, it resets or reframes the nature of being a human being, so that when you come back out of the experience, a lot of the hymns, they sing a lot of hymns. They're like 8 to 12 hour ceremonies. Some of the hymns constantly remind to say, Eu vivo neste mundo. I live in this world. So it's not about escaping this world or transcending this world. It's about learning to live and work in harmony with this world, knowing that there is a bigger picture than what meets the eye.
Well, I have maybe what might at first seem like a weird question, but I think it builds on the question I just asked, and it's sort of stimulated or motivated by what you were saying in reference to Kierkegaard. So when you were saying the secular mentality considers Christianity to be drunkenness, and the Christian considers the secular mentality to be drunkenness. And my question to you from that is, because the Santo Daime are in some sense drinking, right? So there's a drink, a drinking and imbibing of a substance, but like here, like the interesting framing is, like, I think in 19th and 20th century Western culture, I think a lot of people drank alcohol to escape the world. And our entire culture was set up around alcohol to escape the world. But this is a drink which does not make you sort of, like, when you get drunk, you're kind of out of your sort of, let's say your normal cognition. And with this drink, you're out of your normal cognition as well, but it brings a certain clarity and health with it, or can bring a certain clarity and health with it. So I often thought, if our society was built around a healthy integration of psychedelics as a drink, as opposed to alcohol as a drink, that would reflect a certain state of our own sort of capacity to live in the world and raise the next generation in the world. So what do you think about this idea of, the drugs we use sort of reflecting our psyches and the way in which our culture as an anthropologist sort of, live with the world?
Great question. So, yeah, I forget where this comes from, but somebody said once, you can tell a lot of culture by the drugs it uses.
Yeah.
And so, like, if I look at modern, postmodern, Western culture, what do we allow? Like, there are things opening now, obviously, because we're getting desperate. But when I was growing up, it was alcohol, cigarettes, and coffee. So we get caffeine to wake us up in the morning so we can go be productive cogs in the wheel. We then need to have a cigarette break during the day. And then we get home, we're so exhausted, we take a depressant and alcohol to sort of like ease in and relax. And then we get up the next morning and do it all again. So the system allows the substances that allow that status quo, that hegemonic ideology to be perpetuated. But it's not working for a whole bunch of folks, right? And I think you hit on something interesting, that I think about, yeah, there isn't a lot of alcohol. If I go to, so when I went to sort of the Vatican of Santo Daime in the middle of the Amazon, called Seu do Mapia, it's just north of the city of Rio Branco, just outside the state of Acre. When you go there, I don't want to overplay it because there's all the same human problems, greed, interpersonal conflicts, but there isn't much alcohol. There's just a lot of people drinking a lot of daime. So the ayahuasca they call daime. And I should make a quick, for anybody who hasn't heard of ayahuasca, I should quickly just explain that it's the combination of two plants. It can have the different indigenous groups there. It originated in pre-Columbian times with indigenous peoples who eventually introduced mestineo to it in the early 20th century. It can combine many different plants, but the main constituents are a vine called the ayahuasca vine, Banisteriopsis caapi, and which contain some chemicals I'll get to in a moment. The main psychedelic effects come from a bush called the Psychotria viridis, or hyena, they call it. That's where the DMT comes from. But if you ingest DMT orally, it'll get broken up and broken down in the stomach before it has any effect by enzymes called MAOI. That's why they include the vine, the crushed flesh of the vine, which contains MAOI inhibitors, harmine, harmaline. These help to pause or to disrupt the enzymes from breaking down the DMT so it can get into the bloodstream and get to the blood-brain barrier. And so they're drinking a lot of this stuff in these rituals, and it does, there's a certain peace and harmony and sort of people comfortable in their own skin, a really noticeable, striking contrast with the anxiety, the mental health crisis we seem to face here. They've even done studies, I'm going all over the place, I'll pause for a moment. What I want to say is, if you look at the book, Aldous Huxley wrote a book called Brave New World, which is quite famous, and it's sort of dystopic about, kind of like you're saying, the Brave New World characters are trying to escape the world by using soma, this drug that helps them to sort of tune out. Then he took mescaline, had some very strong experiences with psychedelics, and he wrote a follow-up book that is less often read, but I think a beautiful book called Island. And it is a study or a contemplation of what would it be like to have a society that had a rite of passage or an initiation ritual, in early teenage years, when many societies do have a rite of passage. We've lost touch with that in many ways. We don't have sort of a rite of passage. So I wonder if we even grow up. It's a big part of growing up and maturing is having a rite of passage at a young age. And he sort of contemplates if people had access in a safe context to a psilocybin experience, he talks about he's kind of looking at what would society be like. And he talks about we'd be better humans to each other is his theory. I happen to think there's something to that.
Right. The one question that jumps out to me from your reflection is like, in this society you were talking about where they're not drinking alcohol but they're drinking ayahuasca. You suggest they still have human problems. There's still greed. There's still those things. Can you notice a qualitative distinction of some kind? Like,
yes.
Could you go into maybe a little bit about what you perceive?
There's still humans with egos.
Yeah.
It's just that they're consistently putting themselves into a situation in these rituals where they have to take a hard look at themselves and actually realize. So if there's there's something called peya or obstacle. Peya it's almost like karma in the Amazonian ayahuasca context. If I'm really, like Cadell, if I'm really a jerk to you and I yell at you and I project all of my stuff onto you in some interpersonal spat during the week, that will happen down there. They'll get in fight, people will get in arguments. But then we both go to the ritual together on the weekend, and I might be full, that Cadell, he really upset me. Well, the daime and the ayahuasca experience is going to make me have to look at the parts of myself that I'm actively ignoring, the parts of the role I played, maybe how it might make me replay some of the experience in it. So it's almost like holding up a big mirror. So like Alan Watts and Stan Groff would talk about psychedelics as being somewhat akin to like microscopes and telescopes. So telescopes, scopus means to see or to look. a telescope, to look or to see something far away, something that my naked eye can't usually see, and it helps me see it. A microscope helps me to look at something very small that with my naked eye I can't see. It helps me see what was otherwise invisible. The way my informants describe it, they don't use this word, but I put this word in here to try and conceptualize what they're saying. In the Daime works, one gets a chance to look in a suiscope, like suicide, to kill oneself. We don't want to go there, but sua, the Latin for self. A suiscope allows one to look at oneself and see the aspects of oneself that we don't otherwise see. It's a way of observing oneself and being able to, the very aspect of ourselves, that conscious observer that's usually looking outward of the world. I can see that person, I can see that person. It's like looking at the looker. It allows oneself to, that which observes, to observe itself. And in doing that, I end up having, you know what, Cadell was doing his best. He had a lot on that day, and I just sort of flipped out at him because of these sadnesses or these depressions or these unresolved griefs, these neuroses in myself that I'm in my shadow, my Jungian shadow that I don't want to look at. It shines a big light on that shadow, and that's what can be very uncomfortable. Is we humans don't like to take a hard look at ourselves. It's much easier to judge other people. So to answer your question, in the Amazon, it's not like people don't have human conflict. It's just that they're it's very noticeable that whereas an argument might get out of hand into like a fist fight at a bar if people are drinking alcohol because they're so lost in their own ego and having to be better than the other person, this dog-eat-dog, sharp elbows world we've created in the West, if there's an argument, there's more likelihood that it won't escalate, and that there's humility that is sort of interwoven into the argument because both people are constantly engaged in taking a hard look at themselves.
Well, I can think of many sort of familial conflicts, intimate conflicts, can be conflicts within the working world or whatever dimension of our normal human life that in principle could be enhanced if we did have types of ritual experiences where we were encouraged to look deeper into our souls or deeper into ourselves, as opposed to building a culture around escapism and numbing ourselves and so forth. What do you think are some of the, say, new problems or new conflicts that might arise from a society where there's a more regular contact with these substances? Because in my experience, for example, with doing ayahuasca, I didn't have the proper integration. I did experience sort of, for example, this contrast between being in a psychedelic space where there's just so much meaning and so much joy and so much feeling of homeness, whereas in the world there is that, sharp-elbowed world you're talking about, the dog-eat-dog world. I mean, I've still got to, earn a living and all these types of things. So what do you think? What do you observe? What are some of the conflicts and some of the new challenges that might arise from a more openly accepting and integrating psychedelics into our normal world?
Okay, yeah. So I like that you've highlighted that these psychedelics, there's a lot of hype about them these days, right? And I think sometimes people are jumping on the bandwagon, like this is the new panacea, it's going to solve all our problems. I think that would be an unwise approach, in that, like any human tool, fire, a knife, a car, any human tool can be misused, can be dangerous when in the hands of someone who doesn't know what they're doing or has bad intentions. I think we're so new at this. We're almost like rookies, right? We're almost like in our rookie year. We're very new. And so, again, humility is really important. What I get concerned with are things like my friend Ken Tupper uses the term Messiah complex. Sometimes people will take these substances and think, oh my goodness, I saw God, I saw angels, I must be very special. I've got to go tell the world, I've got to go tell everybody how I figured out the secret of the universe. That often will later on gets sort of checked by some very heavy, deep, humbling experiences if one continues to go with these. I kind of feel like we're in that stage of our culture where we're like, oh my goodness, these are amazing, wow, and we're not really grounded. We're excited, which is fine, but hype can be overhyped, and I think we're eventually going to have to come to a humbling moment of, okay, no, these aren't going to solve the issues for us. I think sometimes in the West we consider medicines as something I take a pill and it does all the work for me. I take a pain pill, an aspirin, and it does all the work without any ask on my part. What the elders in the indigenous traditions have told me, and then my Daimista informants, is that they'll often say, like, the real work begins after the work ends, right? So the ritual work, you might get some insights, some visions, but that's just the beginning. The real work is, as you alluded to, is the integration afterwards. And so that's why I think we have to be really careful about who are we going to trust as the people that distribute these substances, in what contexts, what kind of contraindications, like people that are predisposed to schizophrenia without a strong sort of stable ego would be contraindicated. Psychedelics are not something that people with underlying schizophrenia should be taking. And so on the dark side, as we're starting to legalize or move towards legalization in North America, like, for instance, I've seen a buddy of mine sent a picture from Vancouver where they're selling psilocybin drinks, just anybody who wants them, and then they go take them without any preparation for sort of making sure that they have the right intention, that they're in the right headspace or heart space, that they kind of know what to expect. And to do it alone, especially if you have very little experience, is quite dangerous. So having the proper preparation is really important for how the experience is going to go. Then there's the dosing session. The integration, I think we have a lot more to learn with that, but as you allude to, it's how do I take these otherworldly experiences, and as I come back into my regular world, my regular life, it is sort of a trial and error. It's good. That's why it's good to have a guide or a facilitator or a therapist or an elder or someone who can teach us or help us be accountable as we step by step try to make new choices and new ways of relating to ourselves, other people in the world. It's not easy, so having help and guidance and I'm one, I don't think this should be a free-for-all. I don't think it already is the Wild West, and I think that's what happened in the 1960s when it all fell apart. And so I'm hopeful that this psychedelic renaissance, we've learned enough to slow and steady, like the turtle. I'd rather us be the tortoise than the hare.
Okay, so one of the things that's coming up for me here is we have psychedelic substances, which are ego-dissolving substances, and then on the other hand, if you, for example, struggle with a schizophrenia where you don't have a stable ego, it could be not safe to take them. So what, in your view, it seems to me like there has to be some sort of relationship between the ego and the non-ego, which needs to be understood if we are to integrate these substances into our mainstream society. Is that your view? What do you make of this this weird situation?
Yeah, I mean,
we need an ego, it seems, to some degree.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So they'll often say that the goal isn't, again, that's like that escapist approach that I think sometimes people are just taking it. Some people will take psychedelics over and over and over again. They just keep trying to chase the dragon.
Yeah.
Whereas it's more about getting that taste and that experience. Like I was saying in the green room before we were talking, that old Alan Watts line where he says, once you get the message, hang up the phone. The idea is to sort of go on a trip. Like if you go on a vacation or a trip, you eventually return home. You might have learned things in that experience, but you eventually come home. why, I mean, schizophrenics, I'm not a psychiatrist or an expert in this area, but from what I've read, schizophrenia is about a little under 1% of the general population. You know, if we look at an indigenous New World approach, not to overgeneralize, but many of the First Nations folks in North America will view schizophrenia not so much as an illness, but almost as a gift. That if we can recognize that these people almost have a foot in both worlds, it's almost like they don't need psychedelics. What they need is care and support and community around them to help them be grounded and help them navigate that very awkward tension between being in this world and the other world, and then would value their insights, which we often say, oh, that's illogical from this worldly secular point of view, so we'll just we'll medicalize it and make it into an illness and stigmatize the person. I think it's just that schizophrenics don't need these things to get into a space of opening up the portal between worlds. That's my non-psychiatric, non-expert take. For the rest of us, yeah, for everybody that generally has to live with an ego, it's both, the ego is both necessary and it's a problem. So we do need an ego. I need an ego right now. I'm Marc Blainey. If I didn't have an ego, I'd be a puddle on the floor. I wouldn't be able to carry on this conversation with you because I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between you and me and the phone and the light, and right. So we need it to be able to operate in this world. And yet I'm reminded just this morning, I was seeing Michael Pollan was giving an interview to a British journalist, and Michael Pollan was sharing what an Imperial College London researcher on psychedelics had shared with him. This notion that we need to have, or our ego, our thinking is okay, but eventually when that's all we have, we just sort of start spinning our tires deeper and deeper into being stuck in very rigid, fixed ruminations or stories about ourselves and the world. And the problem is we keep using our thinking mind over and over again, and we never give it a break. We never get to experience what it's like, what thoughtlessness is like, what the absence of thought it is, almost like breathing. It's like it's like if we could only breathe in but not breathe out. And we're taught to, because we're taught that the only part of myself is my thoughts, I am my thoughts, then I try to use my thoughts to fix my my disharmonious or my distorted thoughts. One of my informants talked about how Western psychology tries to figure out ways to resolve ego disharmonies, but it uses the ego to do that, and the ego itself is the problem. What's so nice about Michael Pollan, just to finish that thought, is that as the psychedelics allow us to, for a few hours, experience life and ourselves with the ego just on pause for a while, it allows for a reset of the deck. We can then come back to it with a new perspective of, oh, I don't have to keep replaying those old stories. My ayahuasca journey showed me there's 5 other stories I could be telling myself. Then I get to choose which one of those stories lifts me up rather than makes me feel sort of down in a downward spiral. So I think there is they'll often say it's not about demonizing the ego. It's about the ego playing its proper role. The ego as a tool should be serving our higher self or our deeper wisdom self, the heart, instead of now where the ego is very domineering and the imbalance of ego power in our own self and the collective society is sort of the roots of our mental health crisis.
So in this sort of ideological tension where we sort of started analyzing between the secular ideology and the religious ideology, in your book you kind of call it foundational dilemmas of ideology, these two polar opposites, and my thought that's coming up now is something along the lines of, are both of these ideologies a function of ego domineering? And then on the other hand, when we put this psychedelic trance state, if we find a way to contain this psychedelic trance state in some way, that it puts that at the center as opposed to our egos at the center. But as you already have alluded to, and this is maybe, I think, what might bring out something new in the conversation potentially, is that in the 1960s Western experimentation, there was this explosion of the trance state as it related to psychedelics, but there weren't the, let's say, matured religious containers that could contain that trance state. And the thing that struck me so powerfully when I practiced with the Santo Daime was how nice and mature and structured the entire space was. The music, the building, the architecture, the different differentiation of specialized functions of the people in the church who are helping different people at different stages through the process. Now, there's no, let's say, matured integrative foundation outside of the church, but you see what I'm trying to point at is in the removal of these domineering ego worldviews. I think there needs to be not just a replacing of them with the trance state, but some synthesis between the trance state and structural containers of some kind. I'd be interested to know, maybe they look like religious institutions, maybe they don't. But in your ethnographic research, what do you think the role of this relationship is?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what I hear you talking about is balance, which is easy to say but hard to do. It's so much easier for us to go to one extreme or the other. We even call the term fence sitter as like a negative, as a pejorative. When in fact, I think what we're getting at is being able to be on the fence means you can see both sides. And so, yeah, I think it's easy to either become, that's what these cross pressures between fundamentalist religion, fundamentalist secularism, scientism, it's easier just for me to say, okay, this is right and the other side's wrong. And then I don't have to worry about learning about the other side or about doing all that heavy work. It's harder to maintain a balance. I have to be constantly vigilant. I have to be, I've gone out of balance. I have to now put some effort in. It's so much easier and relaxing to just settle on, okay, there is no God, or there's a God and the people who don't believe in this God or don't agree with me on this are wrong. There is a sort of sick comfort or an ill comfort in ego certainty. So like when people get in an argument, one of my favorite lines when people are arguing is, are you more concerned with being right or are you more concerned with getting it right? And so I find oftentimes we're more concerned with being right? If science and religion are arguing, they're often talking past each other because they just want the other person to admit that they're wrong, to submit to their argument. What I find, again, so refreshing hanging out in these spaces where people are serious, and I think this is what's so important for us to learn from the traditions that have been doing this for decades or centuries. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. It could be Daime. There's two other ayahuasca religions, União Vegetal and Barquinha in the Amazon. There's the peyote traditions of the indigenous folks. There's Iboga in Africa, the Bwiti tribe, the Bwiti tradition. There's all, you can go on and on. There's the mushroom traditions of Mesoamerica. These traditions already exist. What it would take is for Western culture to be humble enough to ask. I think that's where we're almost undergoing a humbling, or we have to eventually hit rock bottom where we admit the very people we've been looking at and demeaning as primitives are actually more advanced and sophisticated in some ways than us. And so we might be very sophisticated. We made iPhones and technology. We're very good at manipulating the material world. We made some amazing, wonderful, good things that have been wonderful gifts to the world. But when that's out of balance with our internal world, the people we've called primitives for so long, they're intelligent human beings like us. They just spent a lot of their time trying to cultivate the inner world and a connection with the inner world. And in that terms, in terms of relationship with our inner world, we are the primitives. And so I think we have a lot to learn in that way. In sort of closing, I think where we can find a balance is in, we kind of have to accept that's the human condition. We have an outside and inside. There's a hard part of us. There's a soft part of us. And it's through engaging in these rituals where I think we're able to find a balance between heart and mind in such a way that we then can learn what situation and what challenge I'm facing. Does it require a thought-based, mind-based, ego-based approach? I want my surgeon, if my surgeon's doing open heart surgery as a biomedical perspective, I really want the surgeon to be using his or her ego. I want them to be working for them. But when we're in an argument or we're in a conflict, that's probably more the time we want to be engaging our heart. And most of us in the Western tradition, especially since the disenchantment and people falling away from the old religious traditions, have lost touch with that heart base. And so all we have is this. And when it's like when all we have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right. So I think we're coming to the dimension of the talk where it might be important to bring up your background in anthropology and how that anthropological lens might impact the way you're interpreting the psychedelics and our relationship to the psychedelics. The main distinction I'm picking up is this distinction between Western cultures and traditional cultures or non-Western cultures, which is it's a distinction I suppose Western culture's been making for quite some time, and has had a huge impact on how we perhaps interpret the emerging global culture. We're living in an increasingly interconnected world, increasingly global culture. So in this distinction between the West as some sort of scientific, technological, mental mastery, and the traditional cultures as more, let's say, communal and organic and socially intelligent and so forth. The thing that strikes me so profoundly is that, and I take this a little bit from my experience in Cameroon. I spent 2 summers in Cameroon doing field research on my own, and one of the things that struck me so profoundly in those summers was, like, the truck was a communal truck, and the TV was a communal TV, and everything was done more as a group. There was less space for individualism. But at the same time, I think, like, for example, when my granddad told me about his childhood in Ireland, he was raised in a house with 9 kids in the bed, so I think about, like, the level at which scarcity and abundance and certain levels of material prosperity allow for individualism to emerge out of a sort of universal traditional background where we were all more communal and more social and maybe more coming from an organic heart space, if we can frame it like that. So in that context, do you think the West has just tried to escape the body through sort of scientific, technological, like that we just want to escape the emotional negativity that comes from interacting with other people? And in that sense, is it kind of universal that humans will try to abstract themselves out of the communal horde?
Yeah. Okay. So these are big, beautiful questions. I just finished reading Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, which is very much, she calls it the human condition, but it's really the Western condition. She doesn't talk about non-European history and traditions. And there's people that have argued that science originated from some of the biases of the Judeo-Christian tradition that sort of looked at spirit good, matter bad. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And sort of labeling material existence and the drudgeries of our condition as bad and as something to try and escape, and made the goal having as much leisure and freedom and peace and pleasure as possible. And in the end, that just is leading to a lot of despair. And so I think I lived like that for a long time, trying to escape things. I to be really honest, that might have been from my own biased Euro-Canadian perspective. I come from Irish stock too. I was trying to transcend in a way. And I think what to my pleasant surprise, the interesting thing is it's almost the inversion of that with ayahuasca and psilocybin, some of the psychedelics. If you look at the psychedelics, they come from the earth, right? Like mushrooms grow on decaying matter, and iboga comes from the roots of the of the boga plant. And ayahuasca, when you drink it, it's like, now from the biased kind of more Christian perspective of Daime, they would see this as, when you drink it, it's the wood of the bark of the vine and the leaves. It's very earthy. It tastes almost like decaying matter in some ways. Very bitter. It's hard to swallow. The Daimistas would see this as similar to almost like drinking Jesus's cross, like drinking the wood of the cross. From an indigenous perspective, it wouldn't have that Christian slant to it. When I drink it, it is almost like having to face, and there is no escape. There is no escape, at least during my time here on Earth, that I am in. I could look at it as I'm condemned to being imprisoned in this body. But what I find so helpful, the helpful sort of subtle but such important shift or reframing of that difficult, almost ego death, shamanic dismemberment, very uncomfortable nausea, vomiting, like a symbolic death, it feels like, is the reframing of that is actually a letting go of needing to fight my condition and actually seeing the earth and my bodily material existence as a teacher, as a way, as a crucible that puts pressure and helps me to transmute and to grow emotionally and spiritually and personally into the very thing. When we look at the enlightened masters, I am not an enlightened master, but when we look at the enlightened masters, we can see they're not trying to leave this world. They're living in balance and in harmony with their place in the world. That is possible. We can accept our condition and work with our condition, but that takes us redefining the way we view our condition.
Okay, so the idea. Well, I learned that you're not an enlightened master, so I'm a little disappointed. But other than that, so in this distinction between the West and the non-West or the rest, the weird thing that comes to my mind, especially in the context of your research and the Santo Daime, is that it's explicitly Christian. The Santo Daime is explicitly Christian, and they are a intermixing and penetrating with other esoteric traditions, Afro-Brazilian, Portuguese, indigenous cultures. So does the very distinction between the West and the other disintegrate here, and how, or maybe another question would be, how does the incorporation of the non-Western cultures in the Christian Santo Daime impact the Christian interpretations?
Oh, I love, I could go on forever about that. So right off the bat, I want to say that from, you want me to sort of speak from this anthropological lens, is that I love Western philosophy. I think you and I share many of the same, so we're fans of many of the same great thinkers over the last 600 years. But it's only from that standpoint. And I find, as an anthropologist, I find it frustrating that there's so many other wisdom traditions we could be in dialogue with and sitting at a table and having an open discussion. And I think there's so much we could learn from them, just as I think the Daimistas are very pro-science. They love that all this stuff's being studied by empirical laboratory scientists. They love to learn from science. They really value it. People in the Amazon love Western technology. In many ways, it does make the harsh life of living in the Amazon easier when you have a motorboat, maybe access to some modern medicine. These things they're not anti-Western views, but it does seem that the Western tradition, we have kind of an arrogance. We like to think we're kind of top of the heap. And so it's hard for us to admit that we might have something to learn from other societies. Okay, so the Christians, syncretism, they like to call it an eclectic religion. It is a form of Christianity, but it's very different than the way we usually think of Christianity as an exclusively Christian or closed system. To them, it's much more of an open system where, if you've heard the term perennialism from Aldous Huxley, perennialism is the idea that all different religions all have a piece of the pie. They all have an avenue that leads to the source, or that leads to the higher power, or God, or heaven. And so they like to integrate and pull from the different wisdom traditions, and almost like the cooking of the ayahuasca itself, they sort of will, it started with Afro-Brazilian, indigenous, and Christianity, but they'll, just like when you're throwing things into a pot to make some sort of food and boil it into a melting pot, you can put in other ingredients. Buddhism, Hinduism are now involved in their Jewish Kabbalah, Islamic Sufism. All the different mystical schools of different religious traditions are welcome. It's sort of a common meeting place of all the different mystical schools. And in that way, I mean, the Christian element, I mean, I've met Daimistas that don't like Christianity at all. They go in there, I have bitter, they'll say I have bitter experiences from my Christian upbringing. Every time we sing about Jesus and Mary, that comes up for me. So they're not really, there are Hindu Daimistas, there are Buddhist Daimistas, there are atheist Daimistas, there are Christian Jewish Daimistas, indigenous Daimistas. Any type of worldview is almost welcome here. They don't even care they didn't care that I didn't become a member. I had no interest in becoming a member of this religion. I was studying it sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, as an anthropologist does. They didn't care whether I believed any of the stuff. They never pushed anything or proselytized. There's sort of a rule with them never to push it on people, never to invite someone. People should feel called to come out of their own accord. So the Christian aspect, rather than being something that's imposed or exclusively Christian, is the way Messidineo would describe it, and the way some of my informants did, was it's sort of a bridge. When anyone here, or when I as a non-Indigenous person encounter the Indigenous spiritual traditions, it's very foreign. It's very hard for me to orient myself, and I'm constantly making mistakes because of my ignorance, because of my lack of understanding of that totally sort of that different approach to reality. I'm learning a lot as I go, but I'm still in like kindergarten. The Christian aspect is sort of like a way to make the indigenous wisdom that ayahuasca comes out of. When Messidineo took ayahuasca and relabeled it Daime, the idea was to take that wisdom and put it into a language, or translate it into an ideological or ontological language that would make sense to Christians or people from the West. And so kind of like when the colonialists came and imposed Christianity on indigenous people, like in Mesoamerica, the indigenous people didn't lose their spirituality, but in order to survive, they would, oh, okay, sure, I'll take Mary, the Virgin Mary. Okay, we'll put pictures of Virgin Mary around, but actually for them, it wasn't the Virgin Mary. It was the moon goddess or some sort of divine feminine goddess from their point of view, or a deity from their point of view. But it was a way to sort of keep what was essential, but sort of hide it and protect it. And that was under the guise of colonialism and them trying to protect and survive. Many Daimistas will talk about this is sort of the opposite. This is an inversion of colonialism, where Christianity is actually being this, rather than this being Christianity appropriating indigenous worldviews or Afro-Brazilian worldviews. It's actually, the power is in the indigenous wisdom and the Afro-Brazilian wisdom, and they are appropriating Christianity in order to propagate and make it more palatable to non-indigenous folks.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about it like that. I've often heard even thinkers like Benny Shannon, who we were mentioning at the start of the talk, frame things as if ayahuasca had a type of mind of its own and had agency of its own and was moving us as opposed to us moving it, so to speak. But there's this inversion of forces when it comes to, let's say, the ego domineering, sort of forcing certain symbolic frameworks onto things versus, let's say, these intuitive images coming to us in trance-like states and sort of making sense from it from the bottom up, so to speak.
Cool.
say the one thing here that's coming up for me is the way you're framing the Daimistas and the Santo Daime as an open system, ideologically speaking, where we can take in atheists, we can take in Christians. You don't have to identify with us. You don't have to join. Like, so for example, when I was practicing with them as well, there's no pressure. There's no feeling like I have to be part of this group now or something like that. There's no proselytization, you know, like you have guys coming up to you on the street handing out pamphlets or something like that. There's nothing like that. It's very much something that you sort of can make up your own mind in that regard. And my thought here is, beyond sort of cultural distinctions of West and the rest, maybe, is that if this sort of trance-like state is at the center and it's the one doing the proselytizing, so to speak, do we touch? And this is why I'm asking this specifically because of your anthropological background. Does this touch a universal dimension where we can talk about, let's say, multiculturalism or multi-perspectivism as it relates to all of the different cultures of the planet, whether we're talking South America, Africa, Asia, Europe, North America? Is there a type of universalism in this experience, and how do you relate to that idea?
So I'm going to try to be careful how I frame this, because that is a very controversial topic.
We get controversial on this channel, though.
Well, that's good. I just mean I want to be respectful that I have a point of view, but other people have a different point of view, and everybody's entitled to their point of view. So it brings me back to the classic anthropological sort of distinction between different ways of categorizing the world. This goes back to the mid-20th century, the idea that some of us are lumpers and some of us are splitters. So like I could have three blocks, 3 wooden blocks, one's red, one's yellow, one's blue. Do I put them all in the category of blocks, or do I categorize them as different because of their different colors, right? So some of us are inclined to be splitters, and our mind likes to do this. We like to break things up. Again, it's very important. Science is able to dissect the world and to distinguish and isolate different aspects so we can understand all the different, the fabric of reality. I think that's really important. So I want to be careful to say each different tradition, each culture has its own distinct, unique nature and makeup, and it's really important, out of respect for each tradition, to to approach it on its own terms, and to notice that it is distinct, and not just sort of blur the boundaries and say everything's the same. So I mean, I can go to a Catholic Christian mass and have a beer afterwards. If I go to mosque, nobody's having a beer afterwards. Like, there are some really important distinctions in the way people, the behavioral norms. So again, I really want to lay that foundation of people are different, individuals are different, cultures are different. It's right and important that we split up the world when we need to. Again, like we were talking about earlier, we get kind of stuck in that framework, that mental only framework of just dividing the world up. Look how divided our world is. We've kind of gone into overdrive of dividing things, and we've lost touch with harmony, with interconnection. I think a lot of people are longing for interconnection. We feel disconnected because we've gone about building a world all based on ego distinctions without the counterbalance of this having, or to also counterbalance it with the notion that even while things are different, they're also the same. I happen to lean towards more of a lumper bias. That's just who I am, acknowledging that's not the only way, where I like to see similarities, or I happen to see them everywhere, and I'm inclined to explore those. I mean, we are all individual snowflakes as human beings. We're all different. It's amazingly miraculous how different we are. And yet, what I'll often say when I do therapy groups is, you get a bunch of people, we could be arguing all day who's correct. We're going to start imposing, and we have a debate about whose point of view is the correct one, or who's different than who. it's hard. It just kind of creates sort of chaos and dissonance. When I get a group of very different individuals in a room, I'll often remind us, like, okay, yeah, we probably have some different opinions. We might have totally opposing views on the nature of reality. Someone might be an atheist. Someone might be a devout religious person. Let's set that aside for now. That's important. Two people could have those views and they could both be correct for their own life. What I like to emphasize is before we meet each other, before we even know each other's stories, we know something really important about each other that we have in common, and that's that we are both dealing with being human. And it's hard to be human. We're all trying to find ways to deal with this life. And so, yeah, I do think I think that's why the mystical schools, Sufism, Kabbalah, all the Christian mystics, Buddhism is like a whole religion that's mystical, the Hindu mystics, indigenous shamanism is distinct, and yet there's some similar. We all have the same neurobiology. We all have the same neurochemistry. There's common properties there. So I think the perennialists would argue, Stan Groff, Aldous Huxley, would argue that yes, there's a common, we're all climbing the same mountain on different paths. But then along came a very good critique of that from Jorge Ferrer. He actually wrote some books in the same series, the same SUNY Press series that my book's in. He talks about a participatory perennialism that is it's not about everything's the same. We can't just say that. The other world, the spiritual other world is vast and very, very complex and very multifaceted. So he likes the metaphor of, no, it's like we all go into an ocean, but we all swim to different shores. In my book, I don't say it explicitly there, but I'll say it now. I try to go on sort of, again, kind of uniting these two different views. I think it's kind of besides the point. Yes, we're different. Yes, there's some ways we're the same. I think it's important to sort of give attention to both of those. Again, rather than the mountain with different paths, rather than the ocean with different shores, I like that the psychedelics just basically bring us to a mirror, this suiscope, this inner mirror. My informants will talk about that's the only thing that matters. They don't care what you believe. They don't care if you ever come again. They want you to live your life. They want you to be you. The only thing that is asked of a person when they enter these rituals is to be willing and courageous enough to follow the ayahuasca, whether it's a real being or not, right? That you mentioned earlier, you alluded to that too, Martin Buber talked about the I-it versus the I-thou approach. Western culture has a very I-it. Nature is just dead matter for us to exploit. Many non-Western traditions see nature as a living being that we have to respect and be in relationship with. Regardless of which of those you believe or anything in between, the only thing that's asked is to go in there, sit in your chair or stand in your space, take the sacrament, and then undergo the journey of meeting your deepest self. And when you meet your deepest self, not just the Daimistas, but a lot of the mystics from different traditions talk about this, you meet sort of a mirror. And oftentimes that mirror is dusty and rusted over because it's had no attention paid to it. Nobody's polished it. So it's just this encrusted, we're disconnected from that deeper self. But the hard work of these rituals, just like a heavy meditation ritual or Sufi dervish whirling, or all the different techniques that different cultures have used to make contact with that inner mirror, the difficulties of the ritual is the polishing process of polishing that inner mirror. And the more you polish that inner mirror, eventually it allows that reflective surface to come, and then it's just pure light emerges. Pure light, and that then starts to permeate your daily life, and it just kind of just becomes less difficult to be human. So whether everybody finds the same way to that, I also see some similarities that there's something about tried and tested rituals that allow people to have that confrontation with their deepest self that seems to be restorative and encourages a higher well-being.
From what I remember, your perspective here on the inner mirror and this, am I pronouncing it right? Suiscope?
Suiscope, yeah.
Suiscope. is something also that Benny Shannon talks about a little bit in his great book. So quoting here from the prologue of your book, you say no group offers a complete systematization on how to live well. So and then on the other hand, you have this sort of lumping tendency towards the inner mirror. So what I'm getting here, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm getting here is that all of our maybe different religious systems offer a different system. All of our religious systems offer a certain incomplete system, which can never close itself 100%. But that what they're pointing towards is potentially something universal, this inner mirror, this capacity to see this pure light that is emerging from the center of our being, maybe, or something like that. I also want to sort of say, maybe on a note that might be interesting for some of my viewers, is that in this distinction between the mountain with different paths and the ocean with different shores, I think Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra approaches both of these in different ways, because he does give the idea that we're climbing a mountain, and he explores this idea and that every path is unique on the mountain, and sort of gives the metaphor for the camel and the lion. You know, you get this idea of, with the camel, the Sisyphus pushing a rock up the mountain and stuff like that. But ultimately, he wants you to transcend above the mountain and start flying. You know, so he sort of leaves the mountain behind in some sense. But he also has this metaphor of the ocean towards different shores, where he says in the future of life, there are 1,000 different islands that have yet to be explored. So he does give this idea, you know, so just to say, there is that interesting connection that might be interesting to explore with Thus Spoke Zarathustra a little bit, because I think both of those metaphors bring different images into my mind, which are interesting.
Well, if I could just
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Just on the idea, so that's a very cool Nietzsche connection. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I do want to emphasize one thing. Is I think it's from the Sufi Islam tradition. I'm not sure exactly. It's kind of a common metaphor we come across, which is the idea of the blind people and the elephant, right? That each different tradition or each person, each approach to life, we're all blind. When we really, if we're humble enough, we realize we only see part of the picture. And so the metaphor says that we're all like different blind people that are touching an elephant and different parts of the elephant. When we think we know everything, when we think we're seeing the whole picture, I might be touching the tail, and the elephant is God or the ultimate truth of the universe, or the ultimate meaning of life, however you want to put it, the higher power as you understand it. If I'm at the back and I'm holding the tail, I go like, well, the higher power, it's like a long stringy thing with a brush at the end. And someone else might be at the ear, and they'll say, no, it's more like a palm tree leaf. Other people might be at the foot, and they'll say, no, it's more like a big sort of it's like a big sort of piece of meat or something. So, and then I often think of atheists as like the ones that are underneath the elephant. It's a very important place to be, to say, and they're saying, no, there's nothing here. There's a big empty space. All of those different perspectives are true about the elephant. They're only partially true. And so when we're having an argument, no, it's like the tail. No, it's like the foot. No, there's nothing here. Then we're just having a big argument, versus I find the humbling experience that these mystical traditions allow us is, oh, I'm only seeing part of the picture. Oh, I realize. And so actually, instead of arguing with the other people, they could help me. Like if I tell them what I see and they tell me what they see, then we'll all have a fuller picture of what it is. Just on the animal metaphor, one of the nice metaphors I like from the Daimistas, because these, I really got to emphasize, this is no walk in the park. These rituals are the most difficult things I've ever done. I've never given birth to a child, which I imagine could be probably harder. This is the hardest thing I've ever done, are going to these rituals. So it's very difficult. You're taken to your absolute limits and beyond sometimes. And so it can often feel like you're totally lost. You don't even have any frame of reference. One of the elders I talked about, it's like being in a sandstorm. And that's why these rituals that's why these substances, when not in a container, can be dangerous. Because if you're in a sandstorm and you have no one to help you know where to go, you can get into real trouble in the real world, because you're so sort of out of this world. being in the container of either the Santo Daime rituals or an indigenous ritual or any of these established containers or traditions is like holding on to even the hymns. Like sometimes the hymns you're singing through the hymns were like the only thing keeping me grounded. And he talks about it's like holding on to the tail of a camel in a sandstorm. You don't know where to go, but if you hold on to that tail, the camel knows where it's going. I'll pause there.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I also like the metaphor of a psychedelic ritual being somewhat similar to giving birth. I think that we can learn a lot from midwifery, and also this idea that while for many women giving birth is perhaps one of the most profound ego deaths of their life, I think that when it comes to the psychedelic process, oftentimes we are giving birth to perhaps this inner mirror that you're talking about. But giving birth to the inner mirror is an extremely can be painful, can be difficult, can be disturbing as well. So I think this, and oftentimes you'll see people who are in their first psychedelic experience, and I've seen people who are in their first psychedelic experience that look like they're giving birth. So it can get that intense. But the question that's coming to my mind now is this. Well, I mean, as we're touching on, I think we're touching a little bit on universal themes here. Is one of the major questions that stands out to me in your work is this idea, which is a deeply anthropological and reflective idea, is why is it that some Europeans are choosing to join what you call the global Daimista movement? And it's within the situation of this context we've been talking about as the dissatisfaction with the extreme polarized views. Is it because of, my first thought would be, is it because both of the two extreme polarized views, they don't really give you access to what I think Hegel would call as the thing in itself, whereas you get this idea, and I had that experience. Let me before I pass it on to you, let me just say quickly that my first experience with the Santo Daime, after I came down from my trip, the first thought that came to my mind was, if NASA had sent me to Mars and back, this would still be more impressive to me. So it gives you access to the thing in itself. This is the idea that I come away with. But why do you think there's this gravitation, and is it increasing? Are there statistics on it?
There are some statistics I discuss in the book. Just quickly on that astronaut, that's a nice way to
the metaphor.
Hear that. Well, no, to hear how you were trying to even find something to grasp, to compare it to, and you end up comparing it to Flight to Mars. I talk about a bit at the end of the book how when astronauts go to space and they look back at the Earth, they often have a mystical experience. They call it the overview effect. All of a sudden it changes the way they view the world. They come back almost and they start talking like mystics or shamans with this grander sort of transcendental approach to being. But it costs millions and millions of dollars to send people, and only a few people get to go.
Whereas the Santo Daime is insanely cheap.
Right. And anybody can do it. Once you've gone, you have to go through an intake interview. It's not just easy to get in, but the Daime is for everyone, but not everybody's for the Daime, they'll say. But I mean, it's like a pittance how much it costs for a tab of LSD or a dose of psilocybin or ayahuasca or any of these medicines. It costs hardly any money at all compared to the space program. And that's why I like this term psychonauts. I've kind of come around to it, is that think about if not only a few astronauts got to go up for millions of dollars to have the overview effect, but if we allowed millions and millions of people access to be psychonauts and have the inner view effect, that's where again we're talking about here. And so I don't think everybody's for this. A lot of people in my family have no interest in doing this personally. They find it interesting that I do it, but it's not for everybody. Not everybody's drawn to it. Not everybody needs it. That's why I think it's so important never to push someone into doing this, because then if someone's having it and they didn't really want it and they have a bad experience, who are they going to blame? They're going to blame the person who kind of compelled them to go. It should really be from someone's own personal intention. Kind of a quick and dirty way to put it is the statistical sort of demographics of North America and Europe. Ray and Anderson, some sociologists, wrote a book, and they talk about, kind of like the book opens, what we opened with here, there are three kind of main subcultures right now in the West. One is traditionals, who we might think of as like Republicans or conservatives or people that are, you know, family values. Let's not change the status quo too much. Then there are more, then there are what Ray and Anderson call moderns. Moderns being more what we call progressives or liberals, or people who want to change the system, have a lot of ideas. And so the traditionals more anti-religion, or traditionals more pro-religion, anti-science. The moderns more pro-science, anti-religion. We see this in the polarization of our politics. And then there's this kind of like Taylor talking about the third way, people who are tired of these old cross pressures and don't really identify with one of the two groups because they kind of like science and religion. And they kind of see a benefit to both approaches. Ray and Anderson, I'm not a big fan of the term, but they call them cultural creatives. And that in their statistical studies, they find that it's about a third for each of these groups. And so one of the groups might be dominating the hegemonic, the sort of overarching power structures of a society, but there's always these subcultures there. And they've been there. You can go back to the ancient Greeks. Some of these same ideas discussed by Plotinus and the Neoplatonists, that we have this tradition going back to the origins of Western society. It's just been muted. So Charles Taylor's supervisor, Isaiah Berlin, would talk about, yeah, we had the Enlightenment, which was this huge expansion, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, huge expansion of traditional religion and science. And then that arose into the Cartesian dualism and this Cartesian split we have. But all the while, there's been this sort of subtle, underground, but always persistent third group that he called the counter-enlightenment, or people that just never bought fully into the Enlightenment. Like, yeah, science is great, but we don't want to throw the baby. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater of religion. And this is sort of a way a lot of people, I think, are noticing that as great as science is, and as much as we want to leave behind a lot of the abuses and the corruption of institutionalized religion as it was practiced, and why people are jettisoning religion in a lot of ways, we can throw the chaff out but keep the wheat. We want to be able to recover this connection to something deeper and bigger than ourselves, because without that, we are left with despair and anxiety and depression and addiction.
I just want to make maybe an interesting connection, that when we are talking about, for example, the interesting metaphorical overlap between the ego death of a woman giving birth and the ego death of a psychedelic experience, that's an interesting way to think about this relation between science and religion, where you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because you're connecting to this giving birth process. You know, you're connecting to the baby. You know, I think that maybe a lot of our let's say Western religious and scientific traditions, they have again lost this connection to the thing in itself here with the baby metaphor. You know, like
yeah, I think that's really nice, and that I've heard people talk about it. It's sometimes like giving birth to yourself.
Yeah.
And in that way, I think it might even, in my experience, it's a little bit more like a metamorphosis. Like you enter the ritual as a caterpillar and you go into this crucible where everything gets chaotic and the sandstorm and all. And that's what happens to a caterpillar. And it almost gets totally dismembered and taken apart. But by some sort of magical alchemical process, it comes out the other side, still the same organism, but totally transformed, a new version of itself.
Yeah, I guess that I mean, while the last one went over, I think with an interesting connection, there's also sort of another connection with Nietzsche there, because in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he has this idea of spiritual metamorphosis from a camel to a lion to a child. So the end process is basically a giving birth to yourself. So that's a nice.
And that's what Jesus taught people to do, was be as little children. If you want to
Exactly.
get if you want to get to the kingdom, be like a little child.
Right.
That innocence, that open, that newness. Children don't act like they know it all, or some children do, but we adults in some ways we do. So very cool connection.
So on that note, oftentimes when I think about what Nietzsche's criticizing in Christianity, I often think that it's a Christianity that's lost, from Nietzsche's point of view, it's a Christianity that's lost touch with the heart. In your view, you call your book Christ Returns from the Jungle. What is the symbolic significance of that title for you? Is it sort of more, does it have a significance? And if yes, or depending on your answer to that question, is it possible that this ritualistic trance-like state could revive the religion from within? Do you think that's a possibility, or?
Yeah, I think we might have to wait and see on that part, but I'm not a Nietzsche scholar like yourself, but it reminds me of this very famous statement, God is dead. And oftentimes we take that, people, nihilists, atheists will take the, see, he's saying that there is no God. I think it's much closer to the way you're saying it, which is making a sort of constructive critique of of exactly what my informants say, which is the current Christianity, Catholicism of Europe. They say it's burnt out. It's only form. It's only a shell, right? It has the gold, beautiful gold buildings, but the spirit, the pilot light, the heart of it is hollow and empty and burnt out. And so in that way, that kind of does tie into, that's what my informants say, that the old Christianity isn't appealing to people anymore. The churches are all empty. Like these ayahuasca rituals take place in abandoned churches, in abandoned chapels, because no one goes there anymore. And yet you have this tradition from the Amazon that is very different. And yet if you read the hymns, if you look at the theology of it, is very much in line with the message of love and forgiveness and humility and everything that Jesus tried to teach about how we can be better versions of ourselves by surrendering our ego and trusting in nature or the universe or something bigger than ourselves, that we are not the be-all, end-all. The ego wants to sit on God's throne. And so it's about realizing that that's not our proper place. Our place is to sit at the foot of the throne and to learn whatever is the creator, whoever threw us into this universe, wants of us. What happens with it, I don't know. There were predictions, there were prophecies from Mestre Dineo and his predecessor, or his successor, Sebastião Mota de Mello, or Padrinho, or Godfather Sebastião, that they predicted or prophesied that this would expand around the world. I don't think it'll ever become a major, huge religion because it's so difficult. I don't think a mega church would ever, maybe it will, but I'd love to be surprised. But it's so difficult that it's not something a lot of people, that the masses, that it's not something that will have mass appeal, I don't think. Maybe it will. But for those seekers who really want to touch the ground of being, I think people are finding it to be a very reliable, satisfying rejuvenation of that spirit that originally did capture the minds and hearts of Europeans for many centuries. And so it's like a way to light the pilot light again. Just when your pilot light goes out in your furnace, it's a way to relight that and get all of the benefits that come from having that, rather than feeling sort of empty and hollow inside, as so many people do today.
Right. I think in your book you call it a mystical key. A mystical key for the.
I don't call it that. Oh. That's the difference between a philosopher and an anthropologist, I think. Like, I have my ideas, but I'm very much, that's what an anthropologist tries to look at ideas through the lens of the informants. And so they're the ones who guided that. I don't mean to correct too much, just as I don't want to take credit for it. That key idea it's a key to solutions. That would be their technological metaphor. And we're using a lot of metaphors today. It's I don't know if you always do this on your show, but I find that's where science is good at quantifiable things that are tangible, that you can measure. A lot of what we're talking about is beyond that, beyond what we have the ability to measure or trap or capture. And so metaphor is sometimes the only way we can use language to get close at or talk around at these otherwise ineffable experiences.
Yeah, and we are using a lot of metaphors, but like one thing I would say about, and I agree with you in terms of the way you're thinking about science as really good at the quanta aspect, but even science requires metaphors, right? Like, so for example, the Newtonian clockwork. So you have the idea of the universe as a clockwork, and then that metaphor then structures the quantification of the clock, right? So there is always a relation there.
Yeah, actually, that's a great point. It's like when I was in high school science class, they teach the Bohr-Rutherford molecule or diagram of the atom. It doesn't actually look like that, but it's an image we use so that we can understand the concept. We do need those bridges, right? So yeah, that's why I think, all these, let's keep the metaphors coming. Then I'll come back to you.
Right. Well, just that, like, oftentimes we do have this, and it probably comes from this polarized ideological climate where we think that metaphor means somehow that it's not rigorous or not serious, or it's, that we have to talk literally, and that we're talking, and in some sense we forget that scientists also are leaning on the same sort of metaphorical thought structures. But you made an interesting distinction between philosophers and anthropologists, which would be interesting to go into, because you have like someone like Nietzsche who, like, if he came up with the concept mystical key, he would be like, that's me, that's my concept, it's a part of my philosophical system, the mystical key, it's a part of this, so forth. But an anthropologist would be much more interested in the existence of metaphysical systems that people are talking about, and you're trying to communicate as best as you can the different points of view in this cultural context. So there are philosophers who are starting to explore psychedelics now. What do you feel is the distinction that you bring to the table as an anthropologist, and what do you see among other anthropologists maybe as it relates to how we're talking about psychedelics and investigating that topic?
Yeah, I think it's a win-win. Like, I love philosophy. I don't think I could consider myself a philosopher. I'm like a philosophical anthropologist, might be the closest I could get to it. So I really appreciate and celebrate, thank goodness there are philosophers out there approaching this. Especially with the nature of this subject, I think we're very quickly going to hit a wall if we don't expand our dialogue partners beyond other European, Euro-American, Euro-Canadian, Euro-Australian philosophers. And by this I mean Nietzsche, or a philosopher, when we approach this philosophically from a Western perspective, it's very much an insular discussion. We're working from a particular framework. We're going to assume that we're going to force it into that framework and make it make sense from that framework in some way. What I think we're on the cusp of is a classic Kuhnian paradigm shift, where I think we're going to very quickly realize that the nature of these substances and experiences challenges or even proves to be inadequate some of the paradigmatic structures we're working with. And that's why I think it would be good for us to start talking to some of the people who've been working with these substances for many years, if not centuries. And in this way, I think we can start to get some new insights about not only how we're going to philosophize about these substances, but about philosophy itself. And so an anthropologist, rather than being an insider talking to other insiders about an insider paradigm, will go and seek out alterity or otherness, and will then immerse oneself. That's why the method of the book and of my fieldwork is ethnophenomenology, not phenomenology, me like Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty doing my own introspective analysis of my phenomenological experience. Ethnophenomenology is I go particularly to other cultures that are organized around extraordinary experiences. I don't have to become an insider, but I immerse myself in that very different culture repeatedly so that I can have the experience they're having. And instead of interpreting it myself, I take that raw material of my experience and I pose those questions, those queries to the insiders as an outsider, and they give me back their insider perspectives, which I could never predict and are usually so outside my frame of reference that I have to change my frame of reference. I have to change my paradigm or expand it so that I can adjust to this new information. And so in that way, anthropologists, we have a foot in both worlds. We have a foot in the insider perspective and a foot in the outsider perspective so that we can translate the insider perspective into language that is understandable by the outside world. That's why I'm hoping, in many of my informants are considered criminals in the countries where they operate. I'm hoping a lot of the book is trying to speak to scientists and policymakers to help them understand that this is not a dangerous drug cult. My hope would be in a few years that this is looked at like Buddhist meditation or Hindu yoga as like, oh, that's not really what I do, but I know that's a healthy thing to do, so I'm all right with it. And in that way, that's why as anthropologists in general, our basic approach to scholarship is we study the other, and in studying the other, we can actually learn a lot more about ourselves than if we just studied ourselves.
Right. There's that famous anthropological paper that I think most anthropology students read when they're going through undergraduate about I think it's called Americana or something like that, where there's a researcher who's writing an ethnography about a typical suburban American individual, like brushing his teeth and driving a certain car, but described from such a way as if they're an other.
Yeah, the Asimura. You read the whole thing and you're like, whoa, this culture's so weird.
Yeah, that's giving you that view of the other.
You got it. That's that lens you put on. We make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. That's what anthropologists do.
Right. I like that. Well, one of the ideas that is more and more becoming a part of my philosophy that's deeply related to this idea of alterity and otherness is the distinction between the human and the alien. So so basically this idea would be something along the lines of, the people who are deeply into or deeply adapted to, if that's the right word, the shamanic psyche. They would almost be like aliens in comparison to humans. And so that there's this, it's almost like you could have aliens appear within the human world through sort of a deep, prolonged engagement with this otherness. Which would be like the psychedelic experience or something like that. But I like what you said about you hope in the future that this psychedelic experience would be seen as normative, let's say, brought into normativity within certain grounds as similar to like Hindu yoga or Buddhist meditation. I think really the frontier of our Western culture right now has to be in touch with things that a lot of people in my intellectual circles would label something along the lines of a tantric ecstasy, whether that's in the sexual space, whether that's in the psychedelic space, that there's some sort of ecstatic experience that, if not treated with the respect it deserves, can quickly degenerate into problematic, let's say, behavior or even degenerative behavior. But at the same time, if we pretend like that ecstatic trance state isn't there, then we lose the soul of the culture or something like that. So there's got to be some balance. Again, maybe balance is, I don't know if balance is the right word, but some sort of capacity to hold this ecstatic state. So I guess my next question would be, in your ethnographic research, in your participant observation, after you've finished your research, has your practice continued? Is your practice ongoing? Is it still informing your current anthropological research, or are you onto a new phase of your career, so to speak?
Right. That's an interesting question. I appreciate it. So in studying, I was so excited. What do they say? You might have had the same experience. One of my best supervisors said, before you choose a PhD topic, make sure you really, really love it, because you're going to be so tired of it by the end. Mm-hmm. Like, you have to take it to such an extent. And it was like going to school in two different ways. The Daime is also considered as like a spiritual school or a mystical school. Even the uniforms, they wear these uniforms called fardas, and the real initiated members are called fardados, or fardadas are the women. Fardados being a catch-all term. The blue fardas are actually modeled after the school uniform in Brazil. That you're like students in a school, and you go sit down for the class and you get the teaching, and then you go home and do your homework. I was doing that, and it felt a lot like that. I went through a lot of, there were lessons I learned there that I couldn't learn in a book or learn in any standard pedagogy, deeply personal, important lessons I'll carry with me forever. And at the same time, so that's already arduous enough, but then I found it was like this extra challenge was, not only am I doing all that, but I'm also doing this big research project, going to a standard school back in the United States. And by the end, I was just exhausted, especially after writing the book. I'm just exhausted. I think the Santo Daime is legal in Canada. I'm very good. I'm so grateful to have wonderful relationships with the Daimistas here. I will probably go back periodically when I need it. I haven't been back for a while since writing the book. The pandemic made it hard. But I have shifted. I think I felt a very strong, intuitive need to shift to something new. I think of this project as my foundation, and now next steps are, as they legalize psychedelic therapy, at least in North America, my training as a certified psychotherapist, but I'm also a multi-faith chaplain in the discipline of spiritual care. We can call it psycho-spiritual therapy, or spiritually integrated psychotherapy is the particular therapeutic modality. And I serve as a chaplain or a spiritual care professional, facilitating these psychedelic journeys for participants in our clinical trial out of Toronto. And I'm really liking that a lot. And as it emerges, I think I always wanted to go the academic route. I always wanted to be a scholar because it felt like a safe space to have conversations like this about a very taboo topic. And it's amazing how quickly things have gone. I thought that would be the only safe space, and my real dream would have been to support other folks in having these experiences. And now it's more and more becoming a reality, not just for me, but for many therapists around the world. We're developing competencies to do. We're still in the stages of trying to develop exactly what should that container look like and be like. And so I love being part of those conversations as we start to sort of build a whole new system of healthcare and of ways of exploring the inner world. So yeah, I think I'm more going the clinical applied route. I've also promised my wife not to write another book for a couple decades because she did a lot. I got to give her a big shout out. She's the main reason I was able to get through all of this. She was such an important source of support. And she needs a break from the book as well. So we're going to take a break from that and do more of the clinical applied side.
All right, cool. So I know in some of my conversations about psychedelics, oftentimes one of the major distinctions that comes up is this distinction between people who are seeking psychedelics for, let's say, trauma work, healing work. And there are also people who are seeking out psychedelics for exploring spiritual experiences, and not necessarily about healing, but more about exploring. So there's this distinction between healing and exploring. And in your emerging focus on psychotherapy and integrated care, how do you think these containers will meet these needs? I feel like we need, in my thought, we need integration we need different forms of integration, basically. So it's basically a question of the containers? I guess you're saying we're figuring this out, but what's your view on how this might unfold?
Yeah, so to give us some space, like, it is the Wild West right now. There's a whole bunch of stuff happening. There's a lot of hype. I think there's a lot of folks and organizations, unfortunately, getting over their skis in the hype. I like the more grounded, moderate approach I'm hearing from the psychiatrist who runs the trial that I'm involved with. Dr. Roger McIntyre said to us when we were training that, hey, we're really in like the top of the first inning of this ball game. Like, there's a lot of game left to play with. You don't judge. We shouldn't judge the whole baseball game by the first inning. There's a lot left to learn. So there's, like, I kind of see in this Wild West, there's sort of a spectrum between, on one side, you have people that say we should really be regulating and strictly controlling only in laboratories or only in highly controlled medical environments. On the other end, on the other extreme, you have the sort of more of libertarian view. This should be for everybody, no rules, no judge, because I think a lot of us are chafing at rules and we don't like the idea of that. I fall somewhere in the middle of those, where I think we do need to be very careful. Like you were mentioning earlier, I think we have to be cautious and respectful. These are very powerful tools, and just like other very powerful technologies and tools that you mentioned, midwifery earlier. I think that's a wonderful analogy of, we don't just let anybody be a midwife. You have to go and actually get rigorous training so that we can trust you with this very vulnerable state that the people you're helping will be in. This is kind of similar to midwifery in that I think it should be a controlled act, that just not anybody can do it. You have to prove to a group of your certified peers that you are competent to be able to take people through this. Now, there are many ways, as you say. I think there are people that are atheists and they're just living their truth. They don't want anything to do with God and religion. I totally celebrate if that worldview works for someone. Awesome, run with that. That's great. And in that case, for those many folks who are not interested in any religion or spirituality, I think we are going to need more sort of conventional, therapeutic, Western biomedical, or even just philosophical or meditative, non-religious approaches. I think that can be a system that we can still put checks and balances in there that will help people, will maximize the benefits and will minimize or mitigate the risks. Then there's the groups like Santo Daime, fully religious, where, yeah, people will go there for healing, but they also go there just because they're really interested and curious about exploring non-ordinary states of consciousness. I do think there's some overlap here, almost like a Venn diagram, and I think they're not totally separate, and kind of our theme for the day. I think people that are going for healing will discover or will encounter spiritual phenomena and spiritual ideas. And people that are going for spiritual or philosophical intentions will encounter what feels like healing, or what feels like the identification of parts of themselves that are not healed and may require healing in some way.
Sure. So they both overlap, and even if your intention is to seek out one, you're probably going to find the other as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, as my informants would argue, they're connected in that I would ask them, why do you think, what's the root of sickness and illness, mental, physical? They would argue that, yes, sometimes it's just the universe has decided it's your time to go. You have a terminal illness, we can throw everything at it, and it's just your time. And so there's some things that cannot be healed because it's the person's time. But they would argue that from their perspective, most psychological and physical illnesses are ways that the body and mind are trying to talk to the person, to get the person to pay attention to something in themselves that they're not. I can think of, in my own experience, I don't know whether that's true or not. I find it really interesting to think about, because I, even just anecdotally in my own life, I remember while I was writing the book being really stressed. It was before the book. It was when I was going through comprehensive exams, one of the most stressful times in a doctorate. And I started getting this pain in my pain in the butt, basically, like at the root chakra. And it hurt so much. And I went to the doctor twice. And both times the doctor said, well, you have prostatitis. Here's some antibiotics. Big dose of antibiotics twice. Didn't do anything. And it wasn't until I started exploring around online where some people, sometimes maybe that is what prostatitis comes from. But in my case, it was stress. I was clenching my butt. I was storing the stress energy there and resisting my reality, resisting the stress and pushing it there till my body was trying to say, hey, it was trying to get my attention. It's not until I did some meditative sort of letting that muscle release, teaching myself how to connect to parts of my body I was totally disconnected from, it went away. And so that is in a nutshell, and I've described many in the book of different ways that what I thought was an illness was actually something non-physical and some way that my body was trying to relate to me that I was ignorant of. And then the Daime shining a light on that, and I went, oh, maybe I've got to work with that part of myself that I've been neglecting. And as I worked with it, it opens up and resolves and isn't a problem anymore. But it took me work. It took me working with it. It didn't do it for me.
Right. I mean, I think it's a really important point. It's one I've made in different ways. I suppose in regards to like the way in which some people are prescribed antidepressants for things that don't necessarily have a biochemical foundation. It could have a social foundation. It could have an intimate family relationship foundation. It could have consequences for being upset about your own personal, professional, or intimate relationship development and things like that. So reducing to biochemical explanations when there's spiritual and psychological dimensions to take into consideration, I think, is one of the big transformations that needs to occur in our larger health system. And I think it's interesting to situate your work and some of your observations in the context of that overall shift that needs to occur.
Yeah, you're right on there. I'm in total agreement. It's not, again, I don't want to I love Western science. I love Western biomedicine. But as you say, it's looking at one piece of the picture. It's like the one part of the elephant. There's a part of the existing status quo that really is really invested. A lot of people in power, their careers are invested in the current system. And so it's understandable that when you say, actually, we might want to make a shift in paradigms, that there'd be a resistance to, because well, what happens if I lose my power? That's going very well for me right now. I bring up in the book what I find helpful to help me be patient as this paradigm shift slowly happens, wherever it's going to go, but it's happening, is the story of a doctor back in the 1800s and 19th century named Ignaz Semmelweis from, I think, Hungary. He worked in a maternity ward with a bunch of women, and the death of the person, the mother or the person who was pregnant giving birth, many women were dying in childbirth. And he noticed that if he washed his hands and sanitized the instruments, the death rate plummeted. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, oh, I'll get some scientific data. I'll get all of the statistics together, and he went to multiple conferences and spoke to all the big wigs. And it didn't matter how much scientific data he showed, because he was going against their prejudice, their preconceived notions about reality. They took it as an offense when he suggested they should wash their hands or change the way they were approaching their work. They were like, well, what are you saying? You're saying I have to wash my hands? Are you saying I'm not a gentleman? And they rejected him over and over again. It's a very sad story. He was all by himself. He ended up in a mental institution, and I think died young. Luckily, there are many Semmelweises today. There's me and thousands of other folks that are bringing hard data into these conferences, into these scholarly communities, but we're running into the same resistance. And there's a helpful term called the Semmelweis reflex, named after Ignaz Semmelweis, which is this reflex that scientists and scholars have to new ideas that challenge the existence. So these new ideas are, we should listen to indigenous people, and they have totally different systems of healing that might teach us some things about our own blind spots. Or religion and spirituality might actually have some real value. It's not that they're more important than physical approaches to medicine, but they're just as important in some ways. And when we suggest these, and psychedelics in many ways are at the tip of the spear of this, these arguments, there's just a Semmelweis reflex or an instinct to just push away and react against that because it's so new.
Yeah, it's again an example which I think reflects how you're framing and setting up the preface of Christ Returns from the Jungle, where just because you're within a sort of scientific discipline, that doesn't mean you can escape ideology.
Yeah,
ideology still functions no matter. Ideology is, I know for like a philosopher like Slavoj Žižek, he's based his entire career on study of ideology, and just basically that, ideology is everywhere. You can't really get out of it. Then even the idea that you're non-ideological is ideological, so.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, exactly. If I think I have no ideology, I am missing something. I'm not self-aware. If I think
you're missing that inner mirror.
Well, exactly. If I think I'm in a delusion, if I think I'm immune from ideological bias.
Right on.
So that's why the best thing we can do is just own up to it and be humble about it and go, yep, this is my bias. If you believe differently, that's okay. And maybe I'm wrong. It's that gets at something at the end of the book, Cromwell's rule, which a great philosopher of science at Brussels at ULB, the French school, because there's two different schools. You were at the Flemish school, I believe.
Yeah.
Isabel Stengers talks about Cromwell's rule. Oliver Cromwell had this idea: I don't ask you to think that you're wrong, but I ask you to think that you might be wrong. That little bit of intellectual humility, just a drop of that into intellectual exchanges, can make the whole thing more fruitful for everybody, and less about like banging our heads together. Right.
Well, I think this position of, let's, in the context of biomedical science, this position of the doctor as the all-knowing authority is crumbling, because a lot of people bring a lot of people are investigating their body themselves. They're looking up research online themselves, and they're coming to the doctor, and they know more about what's going on than the doctor does in many situations. So I think having like an educated populace and stuff is part of solving this problem. But sort of in terms of bringing this conversation to its closure, you end the preface by offering a sort of integralist or perennialist worldview, as not maybe as a typical as an anthropologist. You're not necessarily saying I identify as an integralist or a perennialist, but that this worldview is something which you find useful in making sense of the ethnographic data, or what would you say about, like, so just the why I'm framing this question the way I am is because we started the conversation with this distinction between the two ideologies of the scientism and the religiosity, and I know I've talked to many integralist theorists, like, who have studied under Ken Wilber and stuff like that, and they have this idea that integralism is searching for a new house that's capable of containing more plurality than the old worldviews could contain. And certainly when you think of something like Santo Daime, when it's a Christian structure which is integrating indigenous views and Afro-Brazilian views and all sorts of different views, there does have an integralist bent to it. What would be your take on that?
Yeah, so I think you're right that I'm not really taking a hard stance on what is true anywhere in this book. I'm more trying to just, as best I can, because I'm a biased human being as well, try to present, here's what people told me about why they're doing this. Here's how they advised me on how to optimally navigate or pilot an ayahuasca experience within the context of Santo Daime. Yeah, and I, as much as I really respect and like much of Wilber's work and the integralist tradition, the idea that we need to create something new, it might be new to us, might be new to the Western perspective, or, yeah, I guess it would be new to us in this new globalized, interconnected world. But when you put it that way, I mean, it brings me back to the way the Daimistas talk about the daime, which could be the physical drink, but it's also the spirit of the drink that when you ingest it, it goes into all of your system, and then it goes in between or into all the people there, and then the boundaries between the people kind of break down. It becomes this transpersonal experience of feeling interconnected with everybody. That daime, they talk about the daime very similarly to the way the Buddhists discuss the Dharma or the Taoists discuss the Tao. I even think about, so that's the thing, I don't think we need to invent something totally new. We do need to invent containers that make sense to a Western perspective so that there's a hook that people can grab onto. But I mean, many of these integralist traditions like Taoism already exist. I think about just as simple and classic as the yin-yang. The yin-yang is black and white, but there's a little bit of white in the black and a little bit of black in the white. That sort of fractal, holding it loosely and saying, yes, I like a scientific materialist approach that can help with many things. And sometimes I run into troubles there where bringing in or shifting to more of a philosophical, softer, spiritual approach, whatever floats your boat, might help me kind of move along. And then it's kind of it's like we have 2 feet, right? I don't just hop along on 1 foot. It's nice when I land on 1 foot to have the other foot, and I use the other foot. And there's sort of this back and forth dialectic, to get back, that I think we can relearn in a culture that has become very sort of polarized into just black and white. We need to find those little dots of the yin yang. And then I think we really got something we can work with.
I like that a lot, and just for context, that after my psychedelic spiritual transformations, where I came out on the end of my academic journey in my doctorate was actually teaching dialectical thinking. So, like, I actually teach dialectical thinking at the school of thinking at the VUB now. And I do find it very useful for thinking about these types of meta tensions and meta antagonisms, which don't necessarily have let's say, an integrated solution, but they are nonetheless things that we can hold space for, and that we can sort of see the way in which there is a higher order among the polarized perspectives, which we otherwise might be, with less inner mirror, let's say, we might be more predisposed to one of the extremes or something like that.
Beautifully said.
Right on. So if there's any final words or final summary you have for the viewers as it relates to your book, Christ Returns from the Jungle, and your overall, maybe your perspective as an anthropologist, feel free to share.
Well, I just want to say, again, it's been such a joy to get to have a discussion like this. Not everybody likes to have discussions like this, so it's such a pleasure and a privilege to be able to get to talk with you again, Cadell, and I look forward to any times our paths cross in the future. And yeah, just what I think is that we're going to be having a lot more conversations like this as a culture, and I think it's ultimately, as much as we need a balance, right? So I think there's a lot of youthful energy. When I talk to younger folks, younger generations, there's a lot of openness, and it's almost like they take it for granted, a lot of them, that, oh, of course we should go this way because the world is in such disarray that we need a new offering for a way to learn that dialectical thinking or that more flexible thinking so that we can enjoy life and be less harmful to ourselves and others. And yeah, I talked about earlier how there is this Semmelweis reflex, or this resistance that still exists in the established systems and in some of the generations that are currently in power. At the same time, I really want to emphasize, again, the balance, and the dialectic. I would urge anybody out there who's interested in moving into this world in some way, my best advice would be to find an elder or a knowledge keeper, a very trustworthy person, even better than that, a community, to guide you and to share with you the fruits of their wisdom. They've lived decades longer, maybe. And it's good to have community or a sangha, like the Buddhists talk about, to help keep us accountable. My one concern about the psychonautic movement and culture is that it's very easy for it to become individualized, where it's just a bunch of individual psychonauts kind of navel gazing. And what I think the real money is here, not actual financial money, but the real value is we as human beings, I think we're feeling bad because we're all social beings, and yet so many people are feeling disconnected from themselves, disconnected from other people, disconnected from the wider world. I don't think leaning more into the things that are disconnecting us is going to be helpful. Psychedelics are one of many ways in this new blossoming sort of new culture of new ideas, where we can find ways to reconnect with ourselves, reconnect with other people, reconnect with the wider world, and then we're probably feeling better as human beings. I just thank you all, each and every one of you who's listened through all this, and I just send my love out to the universe.
And just because he's so he's had so much experience with the ego dissolution, he forgot to promote his own book, which is Christ Returns from the Jungle. Link in the description. Go out and get it. Yeah, there you go. Christ Returns from the Jungle. Ayahuasca Religion as Mystical Healing. Result of a lot of work, right? Like that's a doctorate is no small task. And
you would know.
Yeah. Right on. Just as hard as going and drinking the daime, I would say.
Yeah, they call one of the Daimistas called it the University of Universities.
Yeah, I like that, and I remember you telling me when we first met, just as that you're in the doctorate program, but you feel like you're in kindergarten when it comes to the ayahuasca school, and that's Benny Shannon talks about that as well, right? Being in school.
I think I might be in like first grade now. I might have
right. So you went up at one level.
Right, but a long way to go. I'm still like a toddler almost, but a lot of growth left for both of us.
Absolutely. All right, Mark. Well, thanks so much for coming on, and thanks for everyone who's listened in. There's a link to Mark's book in the description, Christ Returns from the Jungle, and also if you search up Mark, if you're so inclined, if you search up Mark on Google Scholar, he's got a bunch of interesting papers on ayahuasca and anthropology and spiritual transformation. So check that out as well. So thanks again, Mark.
Thank you, Cadell. All the best.